Here's a number that shaped history: £350 million. That's what the famous Brexit bus promised Britain would save every week after leaving the EU. Millions voted based on that promise. But was it ever true? Today, we're exposing 5 massive Brexit myths that still shape British politics, and the evidence that finally debunks them completely. Beware of the British Red Bus. The Red Bus from 2016 is perhaps the most famous bus in British history. The one plastered with "We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead." That single message probably swung the referendum. But here's the truth nobody wanted to admit back then. The number was wrong from the start. The UK Statistics Authority called it a clear misuse of official statistics. Why? Because that £350 million ignored the rebate Britain got before sending any money. It ignored billions that flowed back through EU programs. The real net contribution in the mid-2010s averaged somewhere around 170 to 190 million per week, according to most calculations. But wait, it gets worse. Britain didn't stop paying the EU after Brexit. Under the withdrawal agreement, the UK owes a financial settlement of £30.7 billion. £25 billion had already been paid by the end of 2024, with about £5.7 billion still outstanding. Payments continued twice a year for a decade. Some pension payments run into the 2060s. That's right, Britain will still be sending money to Brussels when today's teenagers are pensioners. Now factor in the new costs. The border target operating model that started in 2024 adds fees to imports. The common user charge means paying £10 to £29 per commodity line, capped at £145 per shipment through Dover or the Eurotunnel. Every lorry bringing food from Europe now costs more, and guess who's paying in the end? You do, through higher prices at Tesco and Sainsbury's. The Office for Budget Responsibility, Britain's official economic watchdog, estimates Brexit reduces trade intensity by 15%. Lower trade means lower productivity, which means the level of GDP is about 4% lower in the long run compared to remaining in the EU. That's not a dividend, that's a permanent cost. With Britain's nominal GDP at £2.851 trillion in 2024, that 4% gap means £114 billion less output every year. So where's that NHS windfall? Well, it never existed. The bus promise wasn't optimistic, it was mathematically impossible. The money was never there to take back, and Brexit actually cost Britain money through lower growth and new border friction. The most famous political slogan in modern British history was built on numbers that didn't add up. But the bus lie was just the beginning, because Brexit gets blamed for every economic problem when the truth is more complicated. Turn on the news and you'll hear Brexit blamed for every economic problem. Empty shelves? Brexit. Expensive food? Brexit. Labour shortages? Brexit. But here's what they don't tell you. Brexit is just one crisis among many, and often not even the biggest one. The OBR does attribute a 4% long-term reduction in the level of GDP to Brexit through reduced trade. That's real and significant. But consider what else hit Britain. COVID left permanent scarring of about 2% of GDP. The energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine pushed inflation to 40-year highs. Global supply chains collapsed. Interest rates soared worldwide. Every developed economy struggled, including ones inside the EU. Take goods trade specifically. Yes, it's down compared to pre-Brexit trends, but services exports, which matter more to Britain's economy, have actually held up better. Financial services, Britain's crown jewel, adapted and survived. The City of London remains Europe's financial capital despite predictions of mass exodus to Frankfurt or Paris. The comparison that matters is how Britain performs versus similar countries. UK growth since 2016 is similar to large EU peers, sometimes better, sometimes worse. Unemployment stayed low throughout. Wages finally started growing above inflation again by late 2024. These aren't the signs of an economy uniquely destroyed by one event. What Brexit did was add friction at the worst possible time. When supply chains were already stressed, new customs checks made things worse. When inflation was already rising, trade barriers pushed prices even higher. When businesses were already struggling with COVID and energy costs, Brexit paperwork became one burden too many. It's not that Brexit caused every problem, but it made existing problems harder to solve. The honest assessment? Brexit means the level of UK GDP is about 4% lower in the long run than if Britain had remained in the EU, according to the OBR. That's painful, but not catastrophic. Blaming Brexit for everything lets politicians avoid responsibility for other failures like underinvestment in skills, infrastructure, and housing. The UK economy has real problems. Brexit made them somewhat worse, but fixing them requires more than just rejoining the single market. Of course, the economy wasn't the only problem since Brexit was supposed to finally get immigration under control. Free movement ended in January 2021. No more unlimited migration from Europe. Control of borders restored. Job done, right? Except net migration then hit the highest levels in British history, reaching 906,000 in the year to June 2023 according to revised ONS figures. That's triple the level when Britain voted to leave. What happened? The points-based system that replaced free movement actually made it easier for businesses to hire from anywhere globally. Indians, Nigerians, and Chinese workers filled roles previously taken by Europeans. International students could bring dependents. Ukraine and Hong Kong schemes added hundreds of thousands more. The result was immigration transformation, not reduction. See this chart showing migration by nationality? EU migration turned negative, meaning more Europeans left than arrived. But non-EU migration exploded to fill the gap and then some. The care sector alone recruited tens of thousands from overseas to fill desperate shortages. The NHS brought in nurses from the Philippines and doctors from Pakistan. Tech companies hired programmers from India. Universities welcomed students from China. By 2024, the government panicked and tightened rules. Students lost the right to bring dependents from January 2024. Salary thresholds for skilled workers rose to £38,700 in April 2024, then jumped again to £41,700 on the 22nd of July 2025, pricing out many sectors. The result? Net migration fell sharply to 431,000 by December 2024, still well above pre-Brexit levels, but finally declining. The immigration paradox reveals a deeper truth. Britain's economy depends on foreign workers, and free movement from Europe and employers just recruit from further away. The only difference is that European workers could come and go easily, while new migrants from Asia and Africa often settle permanently. Brexit didn't stop immigration, it changed immigration from temporary European workers to permanent global settlement. Politicians promised British jobs for British workers. Instead, staff shortages plague every sector from hospitality to healthcare. Farmers can't find pickers, restaurants can't find chefs, care homes can't find workers at any price. Turns out many jobs only existed because migrants would do them. Remove the workers and the jobs don't become British, they disappear entirely or get filled by someone from even further away. Immigration numbers tell one story, but what about the bigger promise that Britain would finally control its own destiny? Taking back control sounded simple. Make our own laws, set our own standards, chart our own course. No more Brussels bureaucrats telling Britain what to do. Except sovereignty in the modern world comes with asterisks, footnotes, and compromises that nobody mentioned in 2016. Take product standards. Britain created the UKCA mark to replace Europe's CE mark. British standards for British products. Except the government announced indefinite CE recognition in August 2023, then formally updated guidance on the 17th of May to remove the previous end date for most sectors. Why? Because forcing different standards just adds costs for businesses that export to Europe anyway. Theoretical sovereignty met practical reality, and reality won. Northern Ireland shows this even starker. The Windsor Framework means EU law still applies for goods, VAT, and electricity markets there. The European Court of Justice still has jurisdiction where EU law applies in Northern Ireland. Green lanes and red lanes manage trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Identity checks, paperwork, regulatory alignment, all the sovereignty complications hidden in one part of the UK. Even the main trade deal constrains choices. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement includes level playing field provisions and rebalancing mechanisms. Diverge too much on workers' rights, environmental standards, or state aid, and the EU can impose tariffs. That's not sovereignty, that's sovereignty with supervision. Britain can make different choices but faces immediate consequences for doing so. The pattern repeats everywhere. Financial services need equivalence decisions from Brussels. Data flows require adequacy rulings. Aviation needs safety agreements. Science cooperation means accepting EU program rules. Each sector that matters economically requires alignment, cooperation, or acceptance of shared rules. Pure sovereignty exists only for things that don't matter much economically. Perhaps most telling is what hasn't changed. Britain still follows most EU regulations in practice because divergence costs more than compliance. The GDPR data protection rules stayed. Chemical regulations remained aligned. Financial rules track EU standards closely, not because Brussels demands it, but because different rules mean lost business. Sovereignty means the right to choose, but often there's only one sensible choice. The sovereignty paradox is that modern economies are too integrated for true independence. Supply chains cross borders, standards need mutual recognition, regulations require compatibility. Britain took back the theoretical right to control everything but discovered that exercising that right often costs more than it's worth. You can paint your own traffic lights purple if you want, but then nobody knows when to stop. Sovereignty proved messy at home, but surely Britain could now strike transformative deals with the wider world. Distance matters in trade. Economists have known this for centuries, but Brexit believers insisted technology and ambition could overcome geography. Sign deals with growing economies worldwide, pivot to the Pacific, replace European markets with global opportunities. 5 years later, we can measure how that worked out. The EU still accounts for 41% of UK exports and 51% of imports in 2024. That's down a bit from pre-Brexit, but hardly the dramatic pivot promised. Germany alone trades more with Britain than all of India. France matters more than China for UK exports. The gravity model of trade, where proximity drives commerce, remains undefeated. Britain did join CPTPP, the Pacific Trade Partnership, in December 2024. 11 countries, massive opportunities, except the government's own impact assessment puts the GDP gain at 0.08%. That's not a mistake, it's less than 0.1%. All that effort for growth that rounds to zero. The deal helps certain sectors and provides diplomatic benefits, but it won't transform Britain's economy. Other promised deals proved even less impressive. Government modelling shows the Australia agreement adding about 0.08% to GDP in the long run, with the New Zealand deal adding about 0.03%. These are tiny effects with different sectors winning and losing. The UK and India finally signed an FTA in July 2025. But early estimates suggest limited macro impact compared with European trade. Most supposedly new agreements just rolled over existing EU deals. Japan, Canada, Turkey, South Korea, Britain already traded with them freely as an EU member. The new bilateral agreements largely copy the old terms, sometimes with minor improvements, often with worse provisions because Britain negotiated alone without EU leverage. The fundamental problem is that modern trade barriers aren't tariffs, they're regulations. Tariffs are already near zero between developed countries. Real costs come from different standards, certification requirements, data rules, and professional qualifications. Deep integration like the single market cuts those costs dramatically. Standard free trade agreements barely touch them. Distance compounds the challenge. Shipping to Sydney takes 6 weeks. Components from Stuttgart arrive overnight. Just-in-time manufacturing needs European suppliers. Fresh food requires nearby sources. Professional services need face-to-face meetings. You can't replace a market 30 miles away with one 3,000 miles distant, no matter how good your trade deal is. The global Britain vision assumed Europe would become less important over time as Asia grew, but Europe remains a 16 to 17 trillion euro economy on Britain's doorstep, a market of 450 million people. Even if Asia grows faster in percentage terms, the absolute value of European trade dominates for decades. By the time Asian markets might theoretically compensate, Britain will have lost trillions in foregone European opportunities. We've gone through 5 myths and exposed them. Now it's time to add up the real cost. The 350 million never existed, and Britain still pays the EU while facing new border costs. Brexit added economic friction but didn't cause every problem, though that 4% lower level of GDP compounds over time. Immigration transformed rather than reduced, with global migration replacing European movement. Sovereignty came with so many practical constraints that theoretical control often means little. Global trade deals can't replace geographic reality, leaving Britain more isolated without being more global. What makes these myths powerful is they contain grains of truth. Yes, Britain no longer pays EU membership fees, but the net savings are negative when counting lost growth. Yes, Brexit gave theoretical control, but practical constraints remain binding. Yes, new trade deals exist, but they matter far less than maintained European access would. The myths survive because they're not entirely false, just monumentally misleading about magnitudes and trade-offs. The economic consensus emerges clearly from 5 years of evidence. Brexit reduced UK trade intensity, lowered productivity, increased business costs, complicated supply chains, reduced investment, and limited growth potential. Not catastrophically, but persistently and permanently. Like a small tax on everything, a friction in every transaction, a cost that compounds forever. More damaging than economics might be the political culture Brexit created. Every problem gets blamed on or excused by Brexit, preventing honest discussion of solutions. Remainers see only Brexit damage. Leavers deny any costs exist. Meanwhile, real challenges like productivity, skills, infrastructure, and housing get ignored because they don't fit the Brexit debate. The country argues about yesterday's decision while tomorrow's problems multiply. The tragedy is that knowing these myths doesn't fix them. Britain can't unscramble the Brexit egg. Even rejoining wouldn't restore the previous relationship. The EU moved on, the UK changed, the moment passed. What remains is managing reality rather than myths, accepting trade-offs rather than denying them, building something workable rather than pretending perfection exists. Perhaps the ultimate myth was that Brexit itself was a solution rather than a choice. Choices have consequences, some good, some bad, most mixed. Brexit delivered some things voters wanted, like ending free movement and leaving EU institutions. It failed on others, like reducing immigration or delivering economic benefits. It created new problems while solving few old ones. That's not betrayal or triumph, just reality replacing campaign promises. 5 years on, the evidence is clear for those willing to see it. The bus lied. The economics disappoint. The immigration continues. The sovereignty constrains. The global alternative underwhelms. Brexit happened. Britain survived. But the promises that sold it proved mostly mythical. Time to stop fighting yesterday's war and face tomorrow's challenges with eyes open to evidence, not closed by ideology. The myths sold Brexit, but reality delivered something far different. Britain traded European partnership for global isolation, swapped regional integration for theoretical sovereignty, and exchanged managed migration for chaotic increases. The country isn't collapsed, but it's certainly constrained, facing permanent economic headwinds from a choice sold on false promises. Perhaps accepting these truths, however painful, is the first step towards building something better from what remains.